Okay, I think we can start. So welcome to all our participants and our panelists today. It's great to have you all here. The admin have been made co-hosts, so could they please take a check on the waiting room? And with that, let's start off our session for today. So welcome everybody. My name is Jaideep Singh. I'm currently the youth representative of the board of directors of MUN Impact. In addition, I'm also the program head of the online Model United Nations program, as well as the MUN at Home program here at MUN Impact. And I log in from Singapore to be a part of this wonderful panel discussion as a moderator, where today we will be talking about the Earth element, the first day's theme of our E3 summit. And the issue or the panel theme for today is on the involvement of the youth in achieving net zero emissions. Before we start off on talking about this topic specifically, let's try to understand what these open forums are all about. These open forums are an open exchange of ideas from people who have been involved in these issues, who have been involved in these areas, and those who have had experience working with youth and in established sectors and communities in these areas. Today's topic is about net zero emissions, and we are glad to have a wonderful panel of experienced people who have worked in this field and who have had experience in analyzing the data in this field. To ensure the best possible conversations happen, we would appreciate that this is not just a one-way conversation. There is communication, there is a lot of talk going on, and I'll make sure that during this panel discussion, we involve the audience as much as we can. With that short introduction, I'd like to welcome our panelists for today. I'll be taking their names one by one. So we have with us Miss Amy Wickham, who's from the UNICEF. We have Miss Julia Jacobella. Sorry if my pronunciation of the names are incorrect. Do correct me if I am wrong. We also have Miss Tasneem Essop, and we also have Mr. Christian. Okay, I'll just say Mr. Christian S. I don't want to make any mistakes. So thank you for joining, and it's lovely to have you all here today. I'll be starting off with the introduction of Miss Amy Wickham, and then she can go ahead and give her talk about the issue and her thoughts on this, and then I'll be doing this with each panelist one by one. So let's talk about Miss Amy, who's joined us today from the UNICEF. Amy Wickham is a program specialist on climate, energy, and environment at the UNICEF. And since joining the UNICEF in 2013, she's been conducting significant research and analysis on the environmental pollution and climate change consequences for women, children, and young people, identifying technical innovations for more environmentally sustainable programs, as well as documentation, reporting, and awareness, raising through various advocacy methods at each of country, regional, and global levels. She's worked at UNICEF Zimbabwe, UNICEF Mongolia, and is now based at UNICEF headquarters in New York. Previously, she has worked with international organizations in Kenya, India, Ireland, and Rwanda. And she has a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering. So that's something similar to me. I'm doing chemical. She's also studied mathematics, and she has an MSc in development practice. So with that very detailed background, I'd like to welcome Ms. Amy to share her thoughts. Amy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jaideep, and lovely to meet all of you, and great to be here with you. Good morning, good afternoon, and just huge thanks. Thank you for the invitation to be here, participating in this exciting event. And I think it's one that's of critical importance to children and to youth, and their rights and for their futures. So just to firstly say, pleasure to be with you all. Would you like me to give some introductory remarks now, or would you like to introduce the whole panel first, Jaideep? What's the format?
Go ahead with your remarks first, and then I'll go around the back.
Okay, great. So in August, as I'm sure many of you are aware, members of the IPCC delivered one of the most damning reports to date regarding the state of our planet. And experts have noticed that the impact on climate and environment is unequivocal, and that some of these changes underway are already irreversible. It was a shocking report, and it was a very important one, and I think it's critical for the work that all of us are doing to have such important science being shared. A few weeks following this report, UNICEF issued its own, a first of its kind report called the Children's Climate Risk Index. I'm not sure if many of you have come across it yet. This we call the CCRI. It utilizes high resolution geographical data, generates new global evidence on how many children and young people are currently exposed to severe climate and environmental hazards, shocks and stresses. And I can share the link in the chat if that's helpful. But yeah, the results from both are sobering. The report has shown that, the CCRI has shown that almost every child, almost 99%, are now exposed to at least one climate or environmental hazard. And these will only increase in severity as the impacts of climate change accelerate. And a record-breaking 850 million, almost 1/3 of all children, are exposed to 4 or more of these stresses, which is, it's just an incredibly challenging environment for children and young people to be living, learning, playing, and thriving, as you are all aware. Not surprisingly, the children exposed to the most risks are those in the least developed countries and fragile contexts, countries that are, by and large, contributing the least to climate change globally. And focusing on risks specifically inherent to children and young people is critical because they are both physically and physiologically more vulnerable than adults to climate change and environmental degradation. They're less able to withstand shocks such as floods, droughts, heat waves, and they're more likely to become seriously ill or die from exposure to toxic substances like lead and other forms of pollution. And of course, children and young people have their whole lives ahead of them. So they will witness and bear the brunt of this in action today and result in a lifetime of lost opportunity and hardship. One of the lessons that we've learned from the COVID pandemic is the importance of listening to science and acting swiftly in the face of a global crisis. And we must do the same with the climate crisis. And while there are undoubtedly huge challenges, there are also some opportunities to make significant and lasting change. And looking forward to discussing some of these with you. And there's ways to avoid worst case scenarios and predictions. So if we're to talk about achieving the net zero and how to prioritize youth involvement in this, there's just 3 main messages I would like to have us consider as we move forward into our discussions today, that we feel are important to prioritize and over the coming weeks and months and in the lead up to COP26. First, it's imperative that decision makers from around the world, spanning both public and private, recognize that this climate crisis is a child's rights crisis. And these rights are compromised on a daily basis by environmental degradation and by climate change. And therefore, child rights should be explicitly integrated into key national climate change and adaptation strategies and budgets, as well as policies and planning documents, including the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, and the national adaptation plans, the NAPs. Secondly is about education systems, infrastructure, schools curriculum, skills building, training programs. These need to be expanded to teach children and youth about climate change, the environment, and responsible and sustainable consumption and production, because this is what will equip these young leaders with the skills needed to build economies and societies that are both prosperous and environmentally sustainable. And then thirdly, we need to support the meaningful participation of children and young people in the development and implementation of climate policies and plans through inclusive dialogue and consultation. By including young people as active protagonists of climate policies, they will feel ownership over the solutions that will be implemented in the years and decades to come, while also fostering increased intergenerational cooperation and understanding. And as such, if not aware already, I would like to draw your attention to the Declaration on Children, Youth and Climate Action. I'll also pop the link in the chat box when I finish, which was launched by a coalition of children and youth networks with support from UNICEF at COP25 in Madrid. And it's a really strong declaration, an example of children and youth engagement in policy action on this agenda. And then lastly, I'll leave you with some hope. So yesterday evening, I was reviewing a toolkit that we were going to launch on Tuesday. It's a youth toolkit on air pollution. So as part of the International Day for Clean Air for Blue Skies on September 7th on Tuesday, UNICEF will launch youth-friendly materials to do with air pollution. And one of them is a toolkit. And there's a case study in the toolkit that talks about, in 2015, a group of academics published a paper. The paper showed that the ozone layer had recovered, or at least the rate of erosion in Antarctica had slowed down. And in it, the authors showed that without the Vienna Convention, the hole in the ozone layer would have grown by 40% in 2013, with a greater loss in the subpolar latitudes. Although these instruments may seem remote, and when correctly applied, they can guide actions of the different actors to protect the environment and to combat things such as air pollution. So it's extremely important that as we are mobilizing on this agenda towards achieving net zero, that we're familiar about what are the instruments already existing, we ensure their provisions are respected. And this is just a good example of how it is possible to change the course of history. So I felt I needed to end with a little bit of hope after all of the doom and gloom that I had shared at the beginning of my remarks. But that's all for me. Over. Thanks, Jaideep.
Thank you, Ms. Wickham. We're looking forward to have a discussion with you. Some great points there. But yeah, looking forward to the panel discussion. So with that, we now have yet another established individual at our panel today. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Christian Schwarzer, who joins us from the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. Christian is one of the founders of the GYBN and has dedicated most of his life to working on biodiversity and environmental issues. In recognition of his accomplishments in biodiversity policy and advocacy, he has been appointed as Youth Ambassador to the UN Decade on Biodiversity. He's a member of the NAJU and co-chair of Germany's NGO Working Group on Biodiversity Policy. He's also participated in over 25 rounds of UN negotiations under the UNFCCC, IPBES, and the CBD, and has published numerous articles and studies on environmental policy issues, and he's also one of the lead authors of the CBO, in a nutshell. With that very detailed introduction, please join me in welcoming Christian to the floor. Christian, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this wonderful introduction indeed. I'm greeting you all from Marseille. I'm sitting here in a hidden corner of this conference center, somewhere on the floor next to an emergency exit where I hope I could find a quiet environment to join this event. So thank you so much for organizing this. Thank you for giving me the pleasure of contributing. I really like what you just said, Amy, and I'm gonna try to correspond to respond to one of the points that you made. I'm not sure if I can give you a message of hope though. What I'm most concerned of is that I'm really, really tired of a lot of the reports that have been coming out. We have, you mentioned the IPCC report. You mentioned a number of other reports that are addressing these issues. And as you said, I'm now working on these issues for my whole adult life. Like I started when I was just coming out of high school. There were IPCC reports back then already. And I feel it's all just the same. And I don't want to hear, another announcement of what the science is telling us we should have done. I don't want to hear another announcement of what we should have done 10 years ago, 5 years ago. I don't want to go to another blah, blah conference and hear a president announce that we now finally going to take action. And then once the conference is over, the media goes away, the action goes away. This is the cycle that we absolutely have to break, because what the IPCC report is telling us, what the IPBES report on biodiversity is telling us, is that we're at a breaking point. We are not just at a climate emergency, we're at a planetary emergency. And you have seen it was the pandemic. The pandemic was something so tangible, something so real, something so life-threatening that governments spared no efforts to take action, at least in some countries, at least in some parts of the world where these resources were available. And personally, I was completely shocked what billions and billions we could mobilize in incredibly short time spans to fight this pandemic, to save economies. I was impressed how quickly we could develop the vaccines. A process that normally takes 15 years, sometimes even longer, could be achieved in 1 year. So I'm wondering, why is this not possible when it comes to the climate emergency, to the biodiversity emergency, to the equity crisis that we have around the world? There are so many crises that we have to address, but I don't see governments, heads of state acting with the same sense of urgency that we had in the pandemic. And I think this has very much to do with the fact that the climate crisis is now becoming very real, very tangible. We had floods in my hometown just a few weeks ago that never ever happened before in history. Parts of my city were 2 to 3 meters underwater. That's in Western Germany. And nobody ever has seen any records that this happened before. So now finally people are waking up here and are taking it more seriously. So I know that the theme of your meeting is net zero, but I think it should not just be net zero for the climate, it should be net zero for our footprint on this planet. It should be net zero when it comes to biodiversity loss. It should be net zero when it comes to plastic waste. and all the many other issues that we need to address. Some of the guiding questions that were given to me is, what can young people do to influence this? And there are a lot of things that you can do. I think the most important is to talk about it. To talk about it with your friends, with your family. Be the annoying child that talks to your parents about, some things that we can change. Be the annoying student that goes to the teacher, that goes to the principal, and that asks, why are we not talking about the climate crisis instead of just global warming and climate change in our curriculum? If we can dedicate so much time to learn about chemistry, math, and so on, why can't we have like a subject that talks about sustainable development? And I think this is the change that we as young people have to lead. Get elected, get active in politics on the local level, in your city, in your municipality, help to change curriculums, help to design better, more sustainable local policies. This is all easier said than done, but these are steps that, at least in some countries where democracies are more or less functional, you have the choice to take. And I encourage you to do this. Don't be afraid of, getting involved in politics and fighting for what is right, for what is our future. And when it comes to what we can do in terms of limiting our impact, I think we have to recognize that it's not just about the individual. I just talked about the individual life choices that we can make, and that's important. Every product that we buy in the supermarket is a decision, is something that signals to a company what is it that young people want. But we also have to recognize, beyond our individual responsibility, that this is very much about systemic change. And we need to change we can only do this if we push for policies to be adopted by governments, by international agencies like the UN, by regulatory bodies, by organizations like the European Union that change the system. We cannot do this alone as consumers. So our lifestyle choices and the systemic change need to come together. It cannot be separated from each other. And what is most important, we need to break short-term thinking in politics. That I'm currently missing here at the World Conservation Congress is the opening, where President Macron is probably going to make a lot of announcements. I just was in a session with the French Minister of the Environment, and they're all talking nice things, but it's just targeted at the elections that are going to happen in France next year. And we need to overcome this thinking of just what we're going to pledge for the next election, because climate change is nothing that a politician can solve in a 4-year or 5-year term. This is something that needs to happen long-term, and this long-term thinking needs to be anchored into politics. We see it, for instance, in the US. We had Obama trying a lot of things, of course, a lot of, too little, too late, but that's a different story. And then we saw Trump, and Trump ruined a lot of environmental policies that took decades to build. And that is the problem. If we still have this divide between conservatives, liberals, and the so-called left, then we're not going to make progress. Human rights, I think, are now a consensus. At least that's what I hope, among all political actors. And we need to have the same for climate change, for biodiversity loss, for sustainability. This needs to be something across the aisle that everybody can agree on, and that we can pursue beyond the limits of the few terms that we have. Finally, and I'm sorry if I'm talking too long, we need to start with the profit thinking and the business as usual. The approaches that brought us into this planetary crisis are not the ones that are going to get us out of this. We really need to think transformative. And that also means to address inequality. Politicians, decision makers here in the global north, they usually talk to their constituents in Germany, France, and so on. But we need to think as a global community. We need to address the inequalities that exist between the global north and the global south, and we have to act in solidarity, because otherwise it's just not gonna work. And finally, we need systems in which young people are empowered, in which young people really have the tools, the resources, the means of participation to create change, because this is our future. We're not the leaders of yesterday or of today, of tomorrow. We are the leaders now. We are here tomorrow, and we should have a place. And if the rooms or the tables are not big enough right now, then we need to make them bigger so that young people can be there, so that we can work together as members of all generations. That's the only way forward. And my final point here is, let's please stop talking about transitions. Everybody is talking about a transition to net zero, to climate friendly approaches, all this stuff. For me, transition is just like, a word for business as usual. We need nothing short of a revolution. So please think of that. Think of us starting another revolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you for some of those very powerful points, Christian. It was great to hear you there. Very strong policy perspective. And yeah, we'd like to continue that conversation once we go into the panel discussion. So let's now move into another very distinguished speaker here today. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Julia Jacobella. She joins us from the UNDP. She's a multifaceted, efficient, and reliable policy and communication expert with over 6 years of professional experience in Senegal, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and the UK. Since 2013, she has been working for organizations promoting resource governance, rural development, food and energy security, human rights, gender equality, and equity. She's currently based in New York, where she works as a youth and climate analyst at the United Nations Development Program. Her diversified skill set covers research, monitoring, evaluation, writing, editing, and project management. She has excellent interpersonal communication and analytical skills. She's fluent in English, Italian, Spanish, and French, and she holds a master's degree in environmental law and sustainable development from SOAS University in the UK and a BA in politics, philosophy, economics from Lewis University in Italy. So with that brief introduction, I'd like to welcome Ms. Julia to the floor. Julia, it's all yours.
Okay, so I have a short presentation for you today. First of all, it is my pleasure to join this conversation with you today, and I'd like to thank organizers for inviting me. So the focus of my presentation, can you hear me first of all? Just because I am having some issues. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I wanted to focus on our work on youth empowerment and climate action. So why investing in youth matters. So there are 1.8 billion people in the world, representing the largest generation of young people in history. So investing in and partnering with young people is an essential, urgent, and democratic imperative. Young people have been recognized as critical agents of change in the 2030 agenda, as emphasized in the recent ECOSOC Youth Forum 2021 earlier this year, which was co-organized by UNDP and which gathered more than 20,000 participants. Young women and men need to be seen as and supported as key drivers for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, including net zero emissions. Young people should be systematically included in recovery plans, and youth priorities and youth empowerment should guide COVID-19 recovery efforts. And but let's have a look at some of the key data, key facts on youth. So in the countries where we work, children and youth are often the majority of the population. 600 million people in the world living in fragile and conflict situations. And 1 in 5 of the world's youth are not employed at the moment, and then they're out of education and formal training, with young women outnumbering young men 2 to 1. Specifically, youth unemployment is about 3 times higher than those of adults. The COVID-19 pandemic has magnified the consequences of inequalities, injustices, and the marginalization of youth. Young people are often discriminated against due to their age, gender, and other interlocked forms of discrimination. In addition, the civic space for young people is shrinking. Youth valuable experience and innovative ideas and solutions are still a largely untapped potential for transformative change and climate action. So young people are often excluded from decision-making, and many face extreme risks when they want to make their voices heard. However, the knowledge, energy, and perseverance have helped create a global movement demanding bold climate action from leaders, while driving actions in their communities and countries. We need to support more young people in climate action. So what we're doing at UNDP, we support youth empowerment in more than 100 countries through more than 900 projects. especially UNDP's Youth Global Program for Sustainable Development and Peace. In short, Youth GPS promotes youth empowerment and is designed to sharpen the organization's response to the challenges young people face worldwide by boosting the implementation of UNDP's youth strategies, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the United Nations Security Council resolutions on youth, peace and security, the UN Youth 2030. UNDP's Youth Global Program for Sustainable Development and Peace adopts a multidimensional approach on civic engagement and political participation, peace building and resilience building, economic empowerment, and we consider youth as partners in the 2030 Agenda implementation and monitoring. So what do we do? We work on technical policy and programming support, inclusive partnerships and coalitions and networks, advocacy, research and data, and of course, we focus on youth and climate. So UNDP provides target support to developing countries to announce and implement the nationally determined contribution, ensure NDCs, leveraging NDC processes to advance sustainable development priorities, women's and young people's participation, and whole of government approaches to green job creation and recovery. Through NDP's Youth Climate Promise, we support 119 countries in collaboration with 35 partners. 94% of Climate Promise countries prioritize political will and societal ownership in NDC enhancement and with a focus on gender and youth. In particular, 75% of Climate Promise countries are now prioritizing youth in their updated NDCs. So these are some of the key barriers in youth climate action. So for instance, lack of knowledge and finances, access to information, and so on, and also a tokenistic approach to youth involvement, but we will look at these key issues and some of the recommendations we received from young leaders, such as investing in education, green jobs, and so on, later in the discussion today. So I wanted just to focus a bit more on our work and especially youth participation and environmental governance as a human right. UNDP has been supporting different climate and biodiversity and energy consultations and workshops at the national and local level, but also at the global level. So one of the most recent works we've been working on is the Secretary General's Call to Action on Human Rights through the joint commitment called Step Up on the Rights of Future Generation, with a special focus on climate justice. Recently, in the last few months, we also launched a Youth Climate Tour, a dialogue series featuring UNDP's work on youth and climate at local and national and regional levels. Moreover, we've been hosting e-discussions on youth meaningful participation in climate governance on our platform, which is Spark Blue. I will share the link later. And we've been also working on a guidance tool for practitioners on youth in climate action. So other topics we're also covering is the high level of on energy. We've been hosting consultation on youth perspective in April. We've been co-organizing the ECOSOC Youth Forum session on accelerating action for the planet. We've been working on a biodiversity campaign on Youth Manifesto for Nature to Stop the Same. We've been working last year on the Youth Engagement Plan through the NDC Partnership Program. And we're also supporting the Regional Climate Weeks. There's one upcoming this month on Africa. And also we've been working with other UN agencies and the Youth Advisory Group on Climate, the Youth Envoy, YOUNGO, which is the youth constituencies within UNFCCC, and MGCY, and other networks and NGOs. These are some of the most recent and upcoming international events. We have the UN General Assembly coming up in the next couple of weeks, and also the High Level of Energy, the Youth for Climate Job and Ambition Summit, the Food Summit, and the Biodiversity Summit. So these are some of the key publication and references for your knowledge. I will share some of the links in the chat box and how to get involved with our work and reach out to us for some questions. For any questions, you can reach out to us at youth@undp.org and watch our videos on YouTube, and also join the Spark Group platform to learn more and read our latest reports. Thank you.
Thank you, Jida, for those wonderful thoughts. We finally kind of understood how the UNDP is being involved in this initiative, and it's great to see the active involvement of the youth and trying to get the youth to come in and get involved as well. So some great efforts from the UNDP. We'll talk more about that in our discussion, of course. But before we do that, we need to now move on to our final panelist, who's been very patiently waiting. I thank her for that. We have Ms. Tasneem Essop. She joins us from the Climate Action Network. She's indeed a very senior expert on climate, energy, poverty, and social justice issues, and is the founding director of the Energy Democracy Initiative in South Africa. She's South African born, I lived there for a while, and she's based there as well. And Ms. Essop has significant experience in the climate movement. She has held various senior government positions in South Africa. She was a global climate policy and strategy leader for the environmental NGO WWF International. And she also served as the head of the delegation for the organization at the UNFCCC, including at the Paris COP. During this period, she also served at the board of the Global Call for Climate Action, which is the GCCA, and was an active participant in the work of CAN International. Tasneem is also serving her second term as the commissioner in the National Planning Commission of South Africa. She was most recently appointed to the board of the Sandparks, the leading conservation authority in South Africa. Before she joined WWF in 2008, she held the positions of the provincial minister for the environment planning and in economic development and provincial minister of transport, public works, property management in the Western Cape of South Africa. Before becoming a member of the Western Cape Provincial Legislature in 1994, she was a trade unionist in Kusatu, Western Cape, and she's a qualified teacher. She has a vast management and leadership experience, as we've clearly seen, and she's built consensus among common goals among stakeholders from government, labor, business, and communities. And she's also had a very specific emphasis on finance while building strong organizational governance. So with that very detailed introduction, I'd like to welcome Ms. Tasneem to the panel. Thank you for joining in, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jaideep, and I'm sort of cringing as you were going through that introduction, but thanks very much. And also let me add my thanks to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this event, but in the engagement. And I'm looking forward to hearing, the thoughts and ideas that get generated out of the conversation. So let me just say that I was totally inspired by what Christian presented, the views that he shared and the challenges that he is sharing with all of us. So I want to express my appreciation for pushing us with your challenging intervention. And, I am not going to say that this is, we have to look for optimism. I'm always optimistic, but I'm optimistic exactly because of our experience in South Africa when I was a youth involved in the fight for our freedom in this country. We didn't think we would see it, but we won our freedom in South Africa. And so again, it was largely because young people were courageous, brave, and led that struggle in South Africa. And so I'm always optimistic about our ability to overcome huge global crises or challenges. So I want to say to Christian, I completely support the fact that we are living through a global crisis right now. It's not just one crisis, it's intersectional crises. We are looking at the pandemic being compounded by the climate crisis, being compounded by the poverty and inequality crisis, being compounded by a justice crisis. And actually, please let us not take for granted that we've won the battle on human rights. And then I'm very pleased that Amy and Julia puts into sharp focus the issue of children's rights, of the rights of youth as well. So here we have this. And we are living through the most extremely challenging times, all of us. And there's many lessons to be learned. So I think the pandemic teaches us these lessons very sharply. Some of them are not good lessons. And we should talk frankly about that because it has huge implications for how we will actually address the climate crisis. But let me pivot to the, the net zero theme. And I was really curious about the questions, what can young people do to contribute to net zero? And here I am going to be guided by the science, because yes, I do believe that the science reports are critical and they signaling very real warning, alarm bells are ringing. And we shouldn't be only depending on the science, we're witnessing it every day, right? And in the science, when the IPCC that recently released the report that Amy's referred to, in fact, in 2018, the IPCC released what I thought would have been the game-changing science report, right? The 1.5 report. And there they basically told us, if we don't get our act together within this decade, then all our long-term goals have come to naught. So my first recommendation to young people would be, yes, keep the eye on 2050, but concentrate your work and your energy on what needs to happen in the next few years. I say this because, we've seen this big flurry of announcements by political leaders coming in and saying, we support net zero by 2050, right? We commit ourselves to that. Then we've seen a number of companies who also came out and said, oh, we support net zero by 2050. And then we've witnessed that even the high polluting sectors like the fossil fuel industry has come out and said, oh, we support net zero by 2050. Now, and I need to please apologize for being cynical, but we can all make commitments for 2050. It's so far away that we will never be held accountable for making those commitments in the first place. So it's the easiest commitment to make in terms of rhetoric. So for us, for young people, we should really be keeping the pressure on short-term action. Long-term vision, of course, but short-term action. And unfortunately, as the IPCC recent report indicated, but also just in our analysis and assessment of what governments have put forward, the levels of investment that's still going towards the contributors to climate change, the fossil fuel industry, even with green recovery of COVID, monies are here flowing in their direction. We're not going in the right direction right now. In fact, we're way off track. And so let us be focused. We need massive scaled up transformation of our systems. And that requires massive pressure, work, attention, to get the short-term action going. And yes, individual lifestyle matters, the choices we make matter, but actually when we look at the real causes of climate change, then we have to look at those who are responsible for it. And they're not you, Jaideep, or Julia, or Amy, or me. Our footprints are extremely small compared to the BPs, the Shells, the Exxons, etc. Then we need to look at, so who's funding our crisis, this climate crisis? So we have to go for the banks. We have to stop the flow of the money to the polluting industry, both public and private. So my plea would be, therefore, yes, it's important to think about net zero, but if we don't do things now, we're not going to get to a net zero. Then on the net zero target itself, it is really important for young people to also know that net zero has its own risks. And why are these fossil fuel companies and some governments quite keen, to announce net zero commitments? Because they honestly believe that somehow, at some point, they're going to be able to magically come up with the technological fixes that will achieve a net zero. So there's lots of backdoors that we must be aware of. You would have heard governments talk about, we're going to have a massive carbon capture and storage program, or we're going to have this or that geoengineering technology that will help us fix the climate. Be very, very, very wary of these kinds of things. The climate requires action now. Those technologies are not feasible and available now, or they're extremely unaffordable. And we need to push the governments to do the short-term doable things that they just don't have the political will to do. Fix your energy systems now. The alternatives are available. They've become more affordable, and they are obviously a bit more, you know, the reliability has been dealt with. So you can do that. There's no time to wait for 2050, do it now. And the IEA, and I'm sorry, Christian, to cite another report, but the IEA recently came out with a very, very strong report on this. In fact, you know, talking about net zero, but how do we keep 1.5 in sight? And they, quite boldly, I must admit, because they're usually quite conservative, basically came out and said, we have to stop all investments in new fossil fuel exploration and production in 2021. That's this year. So the reports have told us that we need urgent action. We need urgent action within the next few years and within this decade. And yes, of course, the Paris Agreement talks about net zero, but we have to be very clear about what our responsibility is. And I would suggest that it is going to be us depending on young people to be rattling those cages and keep the focus on short-term, near-term action. And then I totally want to support Christian. This is not about tinkering around the edges and then looking at NDCs and, okay, we're going to allow this NDC that really work and we'll go to another COP and then we'll talk about it. Now we need system change. And system change is dramatic. It has impact. And all of us need to be there to ensure that the system change ends up in a place that is far better than where we are now. And that the systems and the new systems will address these issues that we are so challenged by. The issues of inequality, which includes intergenerational inequality. It has to address the issue of justice. It has to address the issues of human rights. It has to address the issues of poverty, etc. We can't sit in a climate bubble and think that the climate crisis is, you know, separated from everything else. It's the system. And the system needs to change. The system that caused the crisis needs to be changed. And the new system must be far more just and equitable than what we have now. That can only happen with the participation of all, and especially young people. So this about, you know, young people need to be at the tables. That is absolutely an agenda that you must fight for tooth and nail. Do not accept the tokenization of young people, as Julia said. And it's happening so much. And young people are not naive. They're very aware of this. So be brave, be bold, and you are leading. And we respect that leadership. Just please recognize that that leadership has to be to fight for the now, not for the 2050 only. You need to concentrate on what needs to happen by 2030 for the latest. So I know I've been challenging. I'm sorry, but I was just so triggered and inspired also by Christian and Amy, who sobered us up, and Julia, you know, for all the work that you've done. And I just thought, you know, I have the opportunity to speak to this amazing group of young people. What am I going to say? And, you know, as a person that's a bit older than many of you, this is my experience, and change is not easy, change is hard, but winning is possible. And so I want to thank you again for inviting me. Thank you, Jaideep, for your moderation, and I really look forward to the engagement.
Thank you, Ms. Tasneem. That was probably one of the best speeches I've heard on climate change in a very long time. So thank you so much for that sharing. It's been insightful on multiple perspectives, and we really look forward to listening to you and all the other panelists talk about the issues, the guiding questions, and the questions coming in from the participants in the coming few minutes. So thank you so much. And with this, let's start our panel discussion. So this is how it's going to work. There are a couple of guiding questions we have ready, but there are only 3, and I do not want to limit this discussion to them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the floor to anyone who has questions. Please make sure that you put them on the chat first so that I review them, and then I'll call out your name and you can talk to our panelists directly. That way the engagement is something you all will enjoy. So with that said, while we wait for the questions, let's start with the guiding questions. And I think Christian in his speech kind of more or less addressed them, but if you have any additional points, Christian, when we come to you with these questions, feel free to add them in. I'll be going around the panel and asking everyone. So let's start off with our first guiding question. And the guiding question is, what do you think are the small actions that the global youth of today can take to influence policy aiming at net zero emissions? So let's start off with Amy, because Amy's been waiting very patiently. So Amy, please.
Thank you, Jaideep. And just, huge thanks to Julia and Tasneem. And where has my colleague gone? Christian, he's there, for your inspiring speeches. And I loved, some of your concluding remarks there, Tasneem. I completely agree. I was just nodding my head, listening to the points that you were making and how we should be focusing on the now and not accepting the delay and what was getting scaled up systems, and that the young people are already leading and how we respect them, and that, yeah, the fight has to be for now. So I think on the first question, many of us have already touched on it. And my initial response is, what are these small actions that global youth can take? They're already taking them, and they're not just taking small actions, they're taking big ones too. And it's really, it's been inspiring to see how this whole movement of young people engaged in this agenda is actually bringing awareness to levels where it has never reached before. And I'm just grateful, and I'm also concerned, because I feel that it shouldn't be the burden for the children and the youth to take all of this on. I feel sure there are ways that they can be involved, and I suppose this is what I will touch on in this question is, keep doing what you're doing, building this momentum, becoming engaged, connecting with networks, getting the support from peers who are also interested, because it's very easy to run out of energy and run out of inspiration if you're going at it alone. But if you're doing it together with peers who are feeling the same way, it can be re-energizing and supportive as well to have that environment around you. I also think to make sure that how you use your voice and your time is strategic, because you don't want to be jumping from one meeting to the next and turn into a meeting hopper, but not really able to add any value or takeaways or contribute to key outcomes that you feel should be on the agenda and, towards achieving net zero, or, addressing climate change and getting towards meeting targets. So I think those are some of my initial thoughts, but the biggest thought I would have is it's already happening. It's more about how we can support young people to continue and build and scale what's already happening, and to do so in a way that doesn't mean the burden is falling on young people, but just to note that we respect all of this effort that's already taking place, and it's the adults who need to do better to take all of those efforts and make sure that they lead to some meaningful change. Over from my side.
Great. Thank you, Amy, for those thoughts. Let's now move on to Christian. Christian, I know you've already touched up on this quite a bit, but if you have any additional thoughts, we'd love to hear them.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the very, very generous reactions to my statement by Tasneem, by Amy, and by Julia. I really, really appreciate that. I don't have a script here. I just like spoke a little bit from the heart. So thank you for the positive feedback. Well, I just want to directly connect to what Amy said. I think the time for reports and the time for like, soft transitions is unfortunately over. That's what all these reports are clearly telling us. It would be nice if we could do a smooth transition, but this was 10, 15, maybe even 20 years ago. So I think as youth, we have the responsibility now to not accept compromises anymore. We don't have time for compromises anymore. This system change that we're asking for, let's face it, it's not going to be possible to make everybody happy here. But this is exactly what our political leaders are trying. They're trying to make the business sector happy. They're trying to make the people that have made billions over billions from coal mining and so on over decades. They're still trying to somehow make everybody happy. And these are the compromises that's not going to work. Let's compare this to COVID. The countries that were making compromises and were not taking such strong measures, they had very, very high curves when the Delta variant hit. So this is really not an option, and it's going to be the same with climate change. The more compromises we accept, the slower we're going to be able to transform the system in the way that we really need it. And the second point on this is don't allow for greenwashing. There are a lot of buzzwords going around at the moment. There's a lot of fuss currently being made about the term nature-based solutions. I'm at a conference right now where this is going to be a center theme. And I'm not against nature-based solutions or, all the discussions that we have about similar terms when it comes to climate, but we need to make sure that they really create an impact. I don't think that offsetting is going to be the solution. I think it's way too late for this. But we really have to make sure when we design such systems that we make sure what is going to happen at the end of the day, because the people that usually design these systems are not the people that are implementing it. And these are the two worlds that we have to bring together when we talk about it. So don't allow for greenwashing, be critical. Finally, don't forget about equity. I can't even put in words how impressed I am by somebody like Tasneem, who has been fighting against apartheid, who has changed the system. I'm from Germany, I'm a white male, I represent pretty much a lot of the things that you have been fighting against. And I think we have to acknowledge this. There was no way, to just fight half apartheid and make a compromise and, we're just gonna find a middle ground. This was a system that had to be abolished, and it's the same what we're fighting for at the moment. So when we address biodiversity, when we address climate change, we have to think about equity at the same way. We have to make sure that this is a transformation for everybody and not just for the countries that have the money. Finally, Amy gave me a really good point. Don't become a meeting hopper. Sorry, Amy, I feel sometimes maybe that's what I've done for a long time, going to these meetings, trying to remind all the people. I think you have a strong point. A lot of young people go to these meetings because it's nice, it's comfortable. But we should not forget what these meetings are about. So when I go to a meeting, I always try to come with a message from the people that work on the ground, try to bring this message. So please, don't go to these meetings just to share business cards and push your own goals. Go to these meetings and remind the people what it's about. If you're the annoying person in the room that nobody likes, maybe that's your role. Maybe that's what we have to do as young people, even if it's very inconvenient and you have to sit on the floor like me now.
Some very good points there. Thank you, Christian. And I think you echo the same sentiment Amy mentioned when she said that we don't have to become meeting poppers. And I think a lot of us do unintentionally happen to do that. And it's important that we go into the action component. And that's something Immune Impact also espouses a lot, on the action component, the impact component, not just the working, not just the talking. So let's now go to Julia. So Julia, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, so just let me say that I would say to young people here joining us today, but in general, I say keep up the youth-led global movement on climate action, make your voices heard, get involved in local projects, talk to local authorities, follow global negotiations, and read and get informed, which is the most important part. Especially, you can also read the IPCC report launched in August, try to follow and read about climate and environmental policies, join or create national youth centers, because it's been proved that it's a way to speak to leaders, join other existing movements, reach out to Yango, which is the youth constituencies, to the UNFCCC. They also have local groups and chapters all over the world. And just remember that youth participation in environmental governance, including climate governance, is a human right, and that your voices need to be heard and taken into account, and that you deserve a driving seat in climate negotiations. So youth activism, ideas, innovations, and solutions are much needed in this moment. And also innovation and ideas, and you need to share with your peers, share with others, try to make your voices heard. And especially I would say to other adults joining us today, let's listen to young people, but also let's take into account their ideas. Just not listen just for the sake of listening, but really take into account, partner with young people in the same, consider them as peers and not in the top down or hierarchy. Let's stop with a tokenistic approach to youth activism and engagement. So that's my point on this question.
Julia, so again, the youth in engagement component, that's again recurring. And then that's something important, like you said, because if we don't start at the very bottom, then won't impact the very top. And then that really doesn't make a difference, because as long as you aren't united, you can't make a change at the top. That's an important statement like that. Tasneem, we'd love to hear you again.
Thanks. So just to add to all of the suggestions that's come out already, I'd like to make two reflections. One, of course, please continue what you're already doing, as Amy said. And then to make sure that you actually do this through building sustained organization. So what we find, and this is very important, because you do not want to be relegated to, youth are mobilizers. They're on the street once a year or twice a year, or they're doing that's not only, it's a very important role, but that must be backed up by sustained organization. That's how you build power. So complement your courage in these mobilizations that is being held with the backing of sustained movement building, organization, and the building of power, so that you actually have the power. Why are voices not listened to? So you have power, you must exercise that power, you must build that power more strongly, and you must use that power. So that's the first reflection I'd like to make. The second reflection, well, actually, maybe I have three. The second reflection is to come back to a point Christian made. Oh, I'm not sure if it was you, Jaideep. And that's to get into politics. Do not leave the when we talk about system change, then we also have to change the political systems. And whether you think you're living in a flourishing democracy or not, we've witnessed through the pandemic and through other things that that's not the case. Our democracies are under threat everywhere in the world. And so if we can get young people into politics to go and change the political system as well, that would be super exciting. I mean, that should give us all hope. So do not be shy. Don't think that what you see there in politics is not inspiring, it's terrible, it's not the place to be. Don't be deterred by that, because you need to go in there and change it, and you would need a critical mass of young people to do that everywhere. So go into politics, please, whether it's local, whatever level of politics. And then the final point, and this is just back to the theme of this discussion, be very vigilant about net zero commitments. So hold governments and corporates accountable for the commitments that they're making. Interrogate it, look at it, see whether in fact it all adds up. You know, because on the one hand, there's a net zero commitment, on the other hand, countries still exploring and producing fossil fuel. This is happening in the UK. The UK has announced net zero, and now they're busy with Cambo, for example. So you have to interrogate this and hold governments and corporates to account. Just don't accept. We must interrogate, be vigilant, and then hold to account. So those are the three reflections, I think. And they, you know, as I say, Amy said, these are not small actions. These are big actions, and it's already happening. So thank you.
Thank you, Tasneem. So you mentioned some very good points, especially on the politics component, which I think has been quite recurring even in the initial reflections. We'll get back to that. I have a couple of questions on that, and we'll talk about that. But before we do that, we have a couple of questions from our panel, from our participants. So I'm going to call out your names. Please feel free to unmute, maybe even switch on your camera and ask your question to our panelists. This is going to really make things very engaging. If you're still not comfortable, that's okay. Do let me know privately, and then I'll ask your question for you. So the first question comes from, okay, Taskinul isn't here. The first question, then let's bring it from Huwaida, who joins us from Sudan. So Huwaida, would you want to go ahead and ask your question? It's a bit long what you typed here. If you could make it a bit more concise and ask your question, that would be great. Huwaida, are you there? Okay, no worries. So her mic isn't working. Their mic isn't working. So I'm going to go ahead and ask the question. So Huwaida asks, how can we ensure that solutions taken against climate change can continue in the long term? To explain further, I see a lot of government officials and NGOs address issues and try to tackle them, but only manage to do so for a short period of time, most not being able to exceed for more than a year. I think that defeats the purpose of them trying to solve these issues. So what do the panelists have to say on this? So let's start off with maybe Amy again. So Amy, do you have any thoughts?
You're going to have to let someone else go first the next time, okay? I'm delighted to kick off, but I feel bad because if I share something that then my colleagues would like to share, it's already, you know, it's unfair. So yeah, I'm happy to give up the first response for sure. But yeah, I think, you know, one of the concrete things that comes to my mind is just ensuring that the processes, that they're not done in isolation, the evaluation processes, that is. So if you implement a policy, or if there's a policy being implemented, we need to have the tools to see that the policy is working or not. So sometimes the promoters of these policies turn to scientists to ask for advice and to see if they're moving the right way. I think monitoring and keeping track and taking stock is important, and calling out when we're not on track and making it known what those steps are needed, clear, concrete steps towards addressing the issue before it's 2030 or 2050. Over.
Great, thank you, Amy. Let's maybe ask Julia, maybe if you want to go next.
I must say that I totally agree with Amy in terms of even harmonizing interventions. So let's remember that we're part of the solution, and we also need to work together in order to avoid duplication or just, for instance, organizing the same event all over again in different countries. Let's try to find common solutions and just not work in isolation. So I totally agree with her points.
Great, thank you, Julia. Maybe Tasneem, if you want to go next.
Sure, I mean, I completely support the fact that, in fact, climate is not a add-on project type thing, you know. It has to be absolutely embedded in all of the work that governments and all of us do. So if you have national plans, for example, to address poverty and inequality, then climate has to be there. You can't have this as a, you know, oh, we have a little department called climate change. Climate change is something that has to be addressed across the board. So absolutely agree that we have to have sustained and systemic approaches to addressing climate change. It's just not a project approach.
Great, and then finally, Christian, any thoughts?
Yeah, I can only agree with what the previous speakers already said. Well, I think it's really important to recognize that this is a systemic issue, so that we need to integrate this into both all parts of society, but also all parts of government. Because what we often see, especially in developing countries, that you have environmental ministries that have very little resources, that have very little staff, and then you have the mighty Ministry of Agriculture or the mighty Ministry of Economy or Finance. And we need to make sure that all these different parts of government are working together towards one shared goal, and that this is not just like a long-term vision, but that we have a concrete action plan now. I mean, essentially, this is what we did in order to address COVID. And I would like to see similar approaches when it comes to more long-term issues like climate change and biodiversity loss. Also, just wanted to use this to thank Julia for calling on all of you to get active in youth constituencies. I think this is a wonderful mechanism to learn how UN processes are working, and it provides a platform not just to get active in the UN, but also to do something on the ground through the local chapters. Like Yango is doing this, we're doing this as Gibbon on biodiversity issues. So I think this is a wonderful mechanism, and thank you so much to Julia for mentioning this.
Some great thoughts there from all four panelists. Thank you for your thoughts. And before we go into another question from our participant, I have a question to follow up on what we just discussed. So Amy very rightfully mentioned that one very important component here that companies, or for that matter, any organization that works towards a climate change solution, is that the data, the tracking must be essential, and that the scientists and the folks working in this field of studies, they need to be involved very actively. Now, my question is, we have a new sort of fancy name coming up for statistics in the last few years, and that's data science. And when we talk about data science, I think one key element here is that in this tracking process, maybe data scientists can play a very crucial role. But then again, how do we mobilize people who work in this field of study to actually work towards an issue like climate change? What would draw them to this field of study? Not because unfortunately, some people in this field of study, or in that matter, scientific studies these days, run a lot behind ambition rather than general consensus and goodwill of this earth. So what do you think can be done to kind of mobilize that effort to kind of get them engaged in this field? And maybe we can start off with Julia on this. So Julia, yeah,
Sorry, can you, I was just cut off. I have some internet connection issues. Can you just repeat the last part of the question, please?
What do you think could be some good ways to mobilize people who work in data science and tracking and maybe in these more scientific areas to work with the policy builders to try to make sure that these solutions are tracked well enough and then they're propagated over a longer period of time?
This is a tricky question because we know that data can be used sometimes in different ways, and it all goes back to politics again. So we can look at data in a different way. There's no, let's say, even if I say 90% of the countries now are trying to commit to enhance NDCs, which are the national determined contributions, but still there's a 10% who is not doing enough, or big emitters are not working enough to enhance the climate pledges. But still, we can look at the opposite way, saying, but still there's work still, which is to be done. So how to make them work together? I would say, actually, I don't have an answer for that. Of course, as our other panelist, Christian, was saying, it's very important to get involved into politics, because once you know the dynamics, you can also bring data scientists into the discussion and try to look at data in a different way. So we have data, we need to use data for the benefit of the global population. And especially in terms of climate change and youth involvement, we know that it's important to consider all the efforts that governments are doing and also young people are doing, and have a continuous dialogue between scientists and governments, and going back to politics, because it's, as I was reading a comment, climate change is not a political problem, but it's also a political problem. So we have data about it's also how governments have decided to deal with the problem and listen to the population and young people voices. So yeah, I don't have a solution on how to bring them to work together, but let's say that getting engaged into politics, it's part of the solution as well. And pay attention and how data is used for some political purposes.
Most definitely. I completely agree with you there on the communication element and maybe more political involvement. Tasneem, do you have any ideas on this?
To be honest, I must recognize my own, I suppose, disconnection to what drives young people and inspires young people nowadays. I mean, I would agree with you that, of course, it seems like many young people choosing careers, etc., are driven by ambition, maybe. And so I think as an overall challenge for all of us again, and getting back to systems, is to not underestimate the building of value systems. For us to again get back, what kind of values are we promoting and building, especially with young people who are leading now, that helps us prepare for a world where we put the kind of common good before our private interests, for example. That's the only way, but I don't know how you would go about inspiring current data scientists to go and do this good work right now. You guys are best placed to say, okay, so how do we do this? So it would be good to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I agree with you on that element. And I think one more element there is that when you mention the value system, I think that has to be started from a very young age, because it's this generation which will go on to become this generation of scientists. If they have that value base from early on, that's going to help them carry it forward. And that's how the next generation of people will be more serious about this. So I think it's that value-based system which you mentioned, that's very critical. I think I completely agree with you there. Amy, we'd love to hear you.
Sure, yeah, thanks. I think this is a really interesting question. And I guess I have kind of two approaches to my answer. And one of them is like how that data becomes meaningful, you know, and how it gets used. And I think it's really important that it's accessible, it's collaborative, and that it's appropriate for the audience that it's directed to. But I think part of your question was young people who are already engaged in data or who work in the data science sphere. I think there are ample opportunities to be involved in climate, environmental related data. And, you know, one example, this CCRI that we launched in August, UNICEF is hoping, you know, at COP or in the after months of COP to launch a platform. And this would be a platform for all stakeholders to collaborate on this research to better understand and generate evidence on the impacts of climate change on children. So if launched, it would be, you know, partnership that improves global, regional, national, subnational level data on the impacts of climate change on children, so that we can better understand where and how they are affected, as well as solutions to respond directly to children's needs. Because I think often there is a bit of a disconnect between who's creating the data and how is that actually linking for everybody to be aware, understand, and use the data, and then towards policy change. But I think, you know, there are some examples of positive progress in this regard. And one example I find is the development of these youth-friendly materials that we've been engaged in. And this isn't just to promote UNICEF's work. I think from when I was back in Zimbabwe, we do this huge household surveys, the multiple indicator cluster survey. And if you take home the hard copy, the adult version, no joke, it's about that size. And we started doing youth-friendly mix. So the mix analysis was available in a small booklet with much more images, much less text, and easily understandable by somebody who may not be a data scientist or, you know, a scientist. And they were the ones that disappeared from all the pigeonholes. From the adults, they all took the youth one, and because nobody wanted the full heavy text. So what we're doing currently with this climate toolkit, and all the little booklets we're developing, and one that will be on air pollution, and there has been one on the Paris Agreement, like to enable young people to understand Escazú or the Paris Agreement, I think is starting to tackle what is seen as these big sort of policy or heavy data instruments and processes, and just and break it down and use simpler language and be conscious of the audience. Over.
I completely agree with those points. I think making data accessible to those who are not experts in reading it, that's a very important element. I think the UNICEF, the UNDP, and other UN organizations do a tremendous job at that. Not in just in regards to climate change, but a lot of other factors. And I think that's continued. That would be a great way to inspire youth currently involved in data and those who would be involved in it in the future. So definitely great points there. Christian, I know you are a very passionate speaker about this, so I think we'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I mean, I'm working on biodiversity, so I feel the key point here is to recognize that a lot of us are very disconnected from nature, that our education system is very disconnected. And I think we need to make every effort when we talk about values to reconnect people. And I don't think we just need to do this like in terms of curriculums. I think we need to show people why nature is so important, why it is so beautiful. I mean, I don't think that people listen to this, all these horror scenarios, all these messages that the world is going to waste. I think we need to show people why it is important to love nature, why it is the basis for everything. And actually, I was in Singapore a couple of years ago, and I went to a school. I think it was the Commonwealth Fifth School, and there was one teacher that started a program where he was frequently going out with his students to explore nature in the different reserves that exist in Singapore. He was like reallocating his biology class to do it in a forest. You know, these kind of experiences where people are breaking out of the classroom. These are exactly the kind of efforts that we need for people to recognize the value of nature. I also think we need a culture that embraces volunteerism again, because I think Tasneem mentioned it, a lot of people are now very much focused, receive a lot of pressure on getting a well-paid job as soon as possible. But a lot of the work that we're doing when it comes to sustainable development, to climate biodiversity, are efforts where we just need good citizenship. So I think including time in the curriculum for young people to join clubs, civil society organizations, to really get active, I think this is something incredibly important. And there are huge differences between the global north and the south here. I was very privileged because in my country, there are lots of youth associations that you can join, that you can get active with. But when I talk to my friends in South Africa, for instance, it's a decision. You know, you don't have time. You might have to like do that part-time job in order to afford your studies or to afford a living for your family. So embracing this culture of volunteerism, I think, is something really important that we have to pursue. Then, with regards to capacity building, one of my favorite things that we ever did as the Global Youth Biodiversity Network was that we wrote a guidebook to the Convention on Biological Diversity. It's called CBD in a Nutshell. And we actually tried to do everything that UNEP and all the others were not able to do, to write a fun guidebook of how a UN convention works. So we did with a lot of visualizations, even with comics, really to try to create in a fun way why these conventions are so important. And not just the conventions, but also what is biodiversity, how it is all related. So a guide to the Convention on Biological Diversity from A to Z. And the best about this guidebook is, we're now getting requests from the European Union, from a lot of countries, and whenever they send diplomats to a CBD meeting, they're asking if they could get a copy of our guidebook because it explains everything, even how our COP meeting works. And I think these kind of like approaches, we need more of this. We need more of like these introductions for people, like biodiversity for dummies, and we need to make this part of our system, part of our learning process. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. That was some good points there, particularly on the biodiversity element. I'll give you context. I live in Singapore, and if we talk about even in the context of climate change, there's been a recent development where they opened 2 large-scale solar farms which are floating on the sea, and they want to use these to produce energy for the country. And Singapore being not very rich in fossil fuels, they rely on all of this. And then that's one way in which Singapore, as a small country and a developed country, has tried to work towards renewable energy. And in terms of biodiversity, anyone who's familiar with the region knows how rich it is. So in that sense, yes, if developed countries do invest in these areas, there's a lot of improvement. And I think Tasneem mentioned this earlier as well. It's just the lack of political will. And that's the problem. That's the idea. And as long as that is achieved, it's nothing difficult. Things are getting affordable and doable. Before we conclude, we have one very small question. And I think this is a good concluding question. And this is a very recurring theme we've seen. And that is on political will. So we have had Saad, who comes from Pakistan. He asks, how can we as youth get involved in politics and make sure that people follow us as well? How can we convince people about our intentions? And this is a common question recurring amongst youth across the summit and different workshops. And I think this is an important thing to talk about even as a panel forum. So let's start off with Tasneem, maybe. Tasneem, any idea?
Sorry, Jaideep, can you repeat the end?
So
the last part.
The question is, as youth, how do you think we can get involved in politics and make sure people follow us, take us seriously?
Yeah, you know, history has many examples of young people who have actually been in politics, made a difference. I know in our country, we have many young leaders as well. So look, I think the best thing is to do, you understand your local context much better than anybody else. You understand which organizations or formations are there already active, you know, the agendas, you know, the priorities of communities. Working in that, at that level, at the community level, on a consistent basis, understanding the needs of people, engaging all the time, and being visible in the work that you do is important. So not just what you're saying, but what you're actually doing in communities who are hopefully will elect you at some point and identify you as a leader of choice is going to be based on what you've actually contributed to the lives of that community, right? So I think, I mean, there's no blueprint for how you must get into politics. It's all going to be guided by where you are, what you're doing, the role you play, etc. But yeah, being visible in what you do, your actions is going to be really important.
Yeah, that's a very key area there, being visible in your community, being involved in your community. Very, very important.
And be humble, Jaideep. And being humble.
Of course, being humble at the same time. Thank you for those points. I know Julia has to leave very soon, so we'd like to have some concluding remarks from her very quickly. Julia.
Yes, I would say to join the local authorities, try to get involved. Well, depending on the age, because we know that student societies or at the university or even high schools try to get involved at the local level, as also other panelists would say, and Tasneem was saying, it's very important to keep informed, read a lot, look at data, as we were saying before, and try to start with the local level, because it's, of course, it's, once you're part of the, once you join the local conversation, it's easier to understand and get involved at the global level. So maybe start locally, it's easier, and then you get into the negotiation. If you join also youth constituencies, you will have the chance maybe to attend some of the global climate negotiations. And also try to be part of this global youth-led movement on climate change, climate actions. And yeah, and just remember that you will need to, it's your right to drive this conversation, and just don't let's try to keep your voice heard. And keep calling out to politicians and organizations that don't listen to you. Please keep up with the good work.
Thank you, Julia. Those were some very inspirational words for our youth there. Let's maybe have Christian next. Christian, any final comments on how youth can get involved in politics?
Wow, that's such a brilliant question. I think Julia is completely right. Starting at the local level is the easiest. I think that's a good access point. I think what I want to say is it's important to realize that you can't tackle all these challenges by yourself. That's impossible. Like we have a lot of programs nowadays that are asking people to become young leaders and all these kind of things. But what matters much more is that you are able to work as a team. Like in the network that I helped to create, the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, there are specific things that I can help with. Like my parents forced me to go to business school. I hated it, but I learned how to do accounting, how to do all this administrative stuff. I have another friend who is amazing when it comes to designs. There's another friend of mine who is super good when it comes to community building. And I really think if you want to get into politics, you have to be a team player. You should not enter politics because you want to, you know, be in a certain position, minister, member of whatever. You need to go in there because you need to know what you want to change. You need to have a very clear vision of what is your theory of change. And then you need to be able to build alliances, to build coalitions with people that have the same ideas, and then to work together, ideally across the aisle. But yeah, it's always easier said than done. But that would be my advice. Start at the local level. You don't even have to do it like in a political party. You kind of do it in a civil society organization, in an NGO. You can volunteer with the civil society organizations. There are many, many areas of change, but always do it as a team. Don't think that you are the messiahs that is going to solve everything. You have to be part of like a network of a group of people, and together you can create the change that you want to see.
Thank you, Christian. That element of togetherness, and also the element of you not having to be in electoral politics to be in politics, is a very important tool there. You can be in any kind of politics. It does not have to be electoral politics. And then we finally go to the panelists we started with. Amy, over to you for the final remarks.
Thanks, Jaideep. Yeah, I very much just feel, to echo what my colleagues have said, I think collaborate, you know, connect with your network, work together. I think ask for help. Don't be afraid to ask for help if any of this is daunting or challenging, or you're unsure about certain components of this journey of advocacy and engaging with policy. I think focus on your strengths. I think each and every one of us, you know, when we work as a team, we do better when we focus on our strengths. And I think each and every one of you on this call and in this meeting, in this event, has something really valuable to bring to the table. So focus on that. Don't try and take on all of the other aspects. I think becoming very aware of those around you and who it is you're trying to get the attention of, so that you can be strategic in your engagements, and then start now. I think this is something Tasneem said quite a few times, and yeah, I think don't worry about where you are on that journey. If you're at the early stage or you're toward the end and you're, you know, really advanced, just start now. And that's it. And the best of luck. And I also have to jump off, but it's been such a pleasure. And I just wanted to say thanks again.
Thank you, Amy. And with those final thoughts, it's been lovely to have our panelists here today. It's been lovely to have our participants here today. Thank you so much for your time and for those insightful words of wisdom for our participants and myself as well. It's been a pleasure moderating this session. And before I conclude, I just have a few words. So we have Tasneem here, who's from South Africa. And I've lived in South Africa for a beautiful amount of time. And I was there when Nelson Mandela passed away. And he's one person I look up to for inspiration almost every day. And he said this one thing about leadership. And he said he was inspired to be a leader by his father, who was the head of a tribe. And he used to say two things. And he's written this in Long Walk to Freedom. He said, one thing he used to say is that they sat in a circle. And the second thing he used to say, that his dad was always the last to speak. So to be a leader, you don't need to learn from a politician who's in electoral politics. You can just learn from your father or your parents, anyone in your community. And with that, I'd like to conclude this session. Thank you so much for joining in. It's been lovely communicating. And to my participants, thank you for being a wonderful audience. And to my panelists, thank you for being people we look up to. And we've heard a lot of very, very inspiring things from all of you. I'll hand it over to my co-SG for the E3 Summit, Vedant. He has a few concluding remarks. Vedant, please, over to you very quickly. Thank you. Vedant, are you there? Okay, for some reason I can't see him. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so basically just wanted to appreciate the amazingly cohesive discussion going on here and with some diversity as well, which just added more thought, more colors to this discussion. Can't refrain myself from thanking Tasneem, Amy, Gilia, and Christian for agreeing to be a part of this, and to Jaideep for taking this conversation so beautifully in a crafty manner. So amazing job. And just would like to say that the inputs that you have put in here will be sure to take action, as you have said, and not let you all down. So those were final things I'd like to say. And yeah, let's stay connected and looking forward to more action and impact together.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Amy. I know it's thank you so much, Julia. Thank you. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, everyone, for joining in.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.